All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'll pray for us. Father, thank you for letting us interact with the book of Romans, and I pray you help us today. Help us see your truth in a clearer way than we've ever seen it before, and see how that truth actually impacts our lives today. I pray that we would see the hope that it gives us, the promise, the call that it makes on our lives, and we pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. So we've entered a stage in our study where we're going to have to slow down a little bit to work through this. So don't be surprised if we don't have homework assignments every day. If we don't get through, we'll just not have one for the next day. But we're going to look at 3 and 4 and recall where we are in the argument. Paul knew about a racist church in Rome. He knew that Jewish Christians hated Gentile Christians, and Gentile Christians thought Jewish Christians were weird. He's trying to fix that. He tackles the Jewish Christians first, and he points out, look, there are new covenant Gentile believers, and if they're new covenant Gentile believers, that means that God has given them the promise of Ezekiel 36. And basically, it's Paul's gentle way of saying, who in the world do you think you are to say, if God has given them a new heart, that they're in any way inferior to you? And so that's where we are in chapter 3, and this is what Paul says as he continues his argument. What then advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. So just because God has saved some Gentiles and applied the new covenant promises to them, it doesn't do away with the fact that the Jews were given special privilege in God's economy. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. But what if some were unfaithful? This word epistason can also mean unbelieving. What if some refused to believe? So this is an interpretive decision in terms of translation, and Paul's going to make the argument, look, the gospel, God's gospel was preached in the Old Testament, so what if some people didn't believe that? That doesn't undo. And then this is really weird in the Greek. Normally you would read this, the faith of God. But it can't mean that here because God doesn't have faith like that. God is faithful. So it's translated faithfulness of God, but you can see how it's related to this word. Their refusal to believe God's promises, their failure in what God did, that doesn't undo the faithfulness of God. And Paul says, by no means, let God be true, though everybody else is a liar, as it's written, that you may be justified in your words, and you may prevail when you are judged, or another way to translate it, when you enter into judgment. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? The fact that when we disobey God, God is still honored, that doesn't undo our responsibility, does it? And Paul says, I speak in a human way, and he says, by no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. When Paul preached, the result of Paul's preaching initially from Jewish Christian people, or from people when they heard the gospel message for the first time, the conclusion that many came to is, well, that means I can do whatever I want. If I'm saved because of Jesus' righteousness, if it doesn't depend on my works anymore, then I can go do whatever I want to do. And it's interesting that people have pointed out that if you preach the gospel and people's initial conclusion isn't that, then you may be misrepresenting the gospel, because that's how people responded to Paul when he preached, like, free grace. You mean I'm saved totally on the basis of not what I do, but on another. And Paul says people who say that's what we're teaching, let's do evil that good may come, their condemnation is just. But then Paul resumes his argument. What then? Are we Jews any better off? And this is what he says. Okay, you Jewish Christians in Rome, you've been judging Gentile Christians. You've been wondering, are we inherently more savable? Are we inherently better than Gentiles? Are we any better off? And Paul says, no, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Quoting from the Psalms there. Here's another quote. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asp is under their lips. Their mouth is full of bitterness and cursing. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. In the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So he's just pearl stringing together one quote after another from the Old Testament. And this is what he says. And he's talking to Jewish Christians. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Now, what he's given us here is the cure for judging other people. So, has this ever been your experience? Like you go somewhere and there are people who are just hopelessly mired in sin. Maybe they're given over to crack cocaine or something, and you go and you look at them, and what's the initial feeling that you have? You have, wow, look at those stupid people, or look at those evil people, or look at the bad choices that those people have made in life. And we're conditioned as a culture to kind of laugh at that, to distance ourselves. And Paul's saying you can't do that. You can't do that, because when you look at somebody else and you have this attitude, oh, they're a bad person, what are you assuming about yourself? That I'm righteous, that I'm better. And you would never say this out loud, but what you're kind of thinking is, I'm just a little bit more inherently savable than that person. So you see somebody who's given over to crack cocaine, or they made all kinds of terrible choices, and you have this assumption when you judge, wow, that's a bad person, and I'm good. I still do bad things, but I'm better than they are. And Paul's saying you can't think that. Whatever the law says, it speaks to those under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world held accountable to God. So I want to share my testimony, and some of you have heard it before and some of you haven't. This may be a little shocking to you, but my mother, my biological mother, whom I've never met, was a 19-year-old prostitute. She was a drug addict in Atlanta. If you've ever been to Atlanta, you've been to the Fox Theater, the Varsity's right there on East Ponce de Leon, North Avenue, where Georgia Tech is. That area in Atlanta I grew up in Atlanta, was just one porno bar after another, one, peep show, prostitutes, drug addicts, from the Fox Theater all the way to the perimeter, if you know Atlanta. Well, my mother was a prostitute on East Ponce de Leon Avenue, and she was a drug addict. And she was a teenage drug addict. Now, what can you deduce in life if someone is so addicted to drugs as a teenager that they're selling their body to finance that habit? What can you deduce about somebody like that? Are they a little bit addicted to drugs, or like lot addicted to drugs? Like totally addicted to drugs. So when I say my mother was a prostitute, she wasn't just a prostitute. She was like this strung out, high as all get out person who is just living for the next fix and willing to do anything for it. That's who my biological mother was. Who my father was, God only knows. But more than likely, he's the kind of man who pays teenage drug addict girls for sex. What does that tell you about the person who was my biological father? How dangerous would it be, would you think, as a man to sleep with a drug addict prostitute? Is that like wise behavior, or is that that's the stupidest thing? Nobody in their right mind would do that. That's who my parents are. If I were born under the Old Testament law, both my parents would have been stoned. And what would have happened when my parents were stoned as being fornicators and drug addicts? What would have happened when they died? I would have died with them. If I were born under Old Testament law, and somehow I had lived, I and my offspring would be excluded from the congregation of Israel for 10 generations. 400 years from now, my offspring would still be too dirty to be included in the people of God, inherently. Now, this is kind of a funny story. I didn't know that till I was 38 years old. And my adoptive parents, who are just salt of the earth people, they still don't know that. In fact, I hope nobody sends this YouTube video to them, because it might be a little hard for them to cope with. They love me, they're great people, but they were lied to when they adopted me. So there was a lawyer in Atlanta, and this is how I know. When I was 38 years old, my adopted dad gave me a letter. And the letter had the lawyer's name on it, and it had my biological mother's name on it, and it had where I was born, when I was born, how much it cost. And it cost $258 for me to be born in 1963. Crawford Long Hospital in downtown Atlanta. The price had gone up a little since there. I don't think you could have a baby for $250 today, but my dad gave it to me. He said, I found this, you might be interested. I took it, but because there was a name, I got very interested. And so there was a woman, never heard her name. Her birthday was on there. Her address was on there. And long story short, through the adoption registry, lady called me up. I was serving as pastor in Jackson, Mississippi. I was living in this manse in downtown. It was part of a neighborhood that at one time had been full of millionaire people. It was a very nice house. I was standing there. I'd sent the money in and asked for the ability to know a little bit about my medical history. And when the lady called me, she said, "Do you want to sit down?" And I said, "Well, that's," I thought to myself, I'm standing in front of a floor to ceiling glass window looking out on 3 acres there in downtown Jackson, this very nice house. And thought, that's a strange thing to say. Why in the world would I want to sit down? Because my adoptive parents had always told me that my biological parents were 2 medical students at Florida State University. I've been told that all my life. And I have an adoptive sister, and she was adopted from a different circumstance. And all growing up, my parents would not expect very much from my sister because they knew her background. But for me, my parents were both doctors. And so they would tell me, "You're smart." In fact, I was so conceited about it. When I walked into a room, I just felt like I was the smartest person there, the most inherently gifted person. And I was probably really, really hard to get along with because, hey, I was pretty full of myself because I believed that both my parents were doctors, medical doctors. Well, when my adopted dad gave me that letter and I called the adoption registry, she said, "Do you want to sit down?" And I thought, well, why? You're about to tell me that both my parents are like surgeons somewhere, and I probably have these very wealthy, biological brothers and sisters, and I'm kind of excited about meeting this another family that I had been hearing about all my life. And she said, "Do you want to sit down?" I thought, okay, I'll sit down. And she said, "I'm going to send you your money back." I paid $25 to get the medical history. And I said, "Why are you sending the money back?" And she said, "Because we don't know anything about your biological mother except 2 things. One, that she was arrested for solicitation, and she was in jail for part of the time she was pregnant with you. And the other thing we know about her is that she was in and out of drug rehab." Well, so I'm sitting there on the sofa, and I'm thinking, boy, that's not the story I heard. You're telling me that my mom was in jail. You're telling me that my biological mom was a drug addict. I can see here that she was a teenager. That's not the story I was told. And she talked some more, but my mind's like running 1,000 miles an hour. We hung up the phone, and I began to think about what had happened. So can you tell me why a lawyer in Atlanta would have told my adoptive mom and dad that my parents were 2 medical doctors in medical school at Florida State University? Can you come up with a reason why a lawyer would have told my parents that?
Because if they knew the truth, then they wouldn't want you.
If they knew the truth, they wouldn't want me. Now, I used to teach business ethics all the time, and we would do this kind of thing. I never told people that, is actually the story of my life, but we would do that where you're the lawyer and, do you tell the truth or not? Today, there are laws in place where you have to tell, and I have friends who are lawyers, and they tell me that people will adopt babies all the time from prison moms, but maybe they didn't know that back then. So the lawyer created what I call a pious lie, created a fiction. And so they told my mom and dad, adoptive mom and dad, that I came from good stock because I guess they were afraid if they said this is a teenage girl who's a drug addict, you know, how would my parents have treated me growing up? How would they have interacted? Would they have thought, you know, the first bad choice that I made, oh, well, there he goes, you know. Well, the truth is, growing up, I had baggage, okay? Can I get a witness? Anybody else have baggage? Like, okay. So my mom was a drug addict prostitute. She was so addicted to drugs that she would sell her body for $5 or whatever it was just to get stoned out of her mind for 5 more minutes or 5 hours or however long. And she still did that while I was a baby. So, like, when I was born, I had all kinds of medical issues, you know, like nobody knew why. Well, why are you allergic to penicillin? Okay, well, what do they use penicillin to treat, you know? Like, why would you be so resistant to penicillin? Oh, I know why you would be resistant, because your mom was a sex worker and she's having to live off of penicillin to not be disease-ridden, just like all the other prostitutes on East Ponce de Leon Avenue. Well, I found out when I was 38 years old that that's where I came from. And you might imagine that that revelation was devastating to me as a person, because it wasn't what I was expecting, and I realized that this pious lie that I'd been brought up with was like 180 degrees opposite of what reality was. That in terms of like inherent goodness, in terms of being smart, in terms of being good, that just wasn't true. And I like to think of my salvation. There's a place I'm thinking of on East Ponce de Leon Avenue, and I remember as a kid we would go from our very nice house in the suburbs and we would drive down and we would go through this area, and there were strip bars and porno places, and but we would go through, and there's a corner there right near the address where my mom put on the medical form, and I imagine God coming up in a limousine, holding a baby, a crack baby, and God coming up to the people on that corner and saying, "This is so and so's baby. Oh yeah, we know her. She works this corner." And God holding this baby, and God asking a question: who thinks this baby will grow up to be a moral paragon of a person? And when God asks that question, everybody laughs and says, that baby is so challenged. I mean, the dad of that baby is the kind of man who pays money to sleep with teenage girls. And the mother of that baby is the kind of person who's so out of touch with reality that she'll sell her own body just to get high for a few more minutes. Nothing ever is going to come from that baby. And God, I imagine God saying, well, who wants this baby? And I imagine everyone on that street corner on Ponce de Leon Avenue saying, well, I don't want that baby. I don't want that baby. Nothing good. And I imagine God saying, I want that baby. I imagine God saying, I choose to love this child out of the absolute cesspool of its birth. In fact, I'm going to love this child out of its sin. In fact, I'm going to make this child a man of whom the cosmos is not worthy. Because salvation is not about what you start with. Salvation is about God. That's the story of every one of us. Yours might not be as bleak and stark as mine. But if we started kicking around in any of our closets, we're going to come to a place where it's not very good. We're going to come to a place where, God starts describing what it is that ultimately produced you, and you're going to be ashamed and you're going to be embarrassed. But the truth is that salvation in the Bible is not about God saving good people. Salvation in the Bible is about God coming to people who are dead, dark, without form and void, under the waters of judgment. It would continue so forever, and God coming and saying, "Let there be light." It was no easier and no difficult for God to save me than it was for God to save Billy Graham. Because it's not about inherent goodness. It's not about inherent worth. It's not about being good. It's not about any of those things. It's about God showing mercy. And I can't tell you, I'm 54 years old now. I've been thinking about that for what is it, 16 years now? And I can tell you this, that truth is one of the most precious truths in the world to me now. Because there's no person on the planet that I can look into their eyes and say, I'm just inherently better than you are. I just inherently came from better stock than you did. I'm just inherently smarter than you are. I look at every single person on the planet and look them in the eyes and say, God is a great God. God saves wicked people. God breaks the power of canceled sin. You know how in this class we've often talked about Old Testament stories, and we've seen that the Old Testament is full of men who fall into sexual sin. Would you agree with that estimation in terms of the Old Testament? Like pretty much everybody, except there's two people who don't fall into sexual sin. You know who they are? Joseph is one. Maybe those, but I was thinking about Boaz. And Boaz, we know, is just smitten in love with Ruth. We know he's smitten in love with her because when he has the opportunity to marry, he marries her 3 o'clock the next day. You tell me, was he smitten in love with her or not? Hey, we should get married. Well, what do you think about tomorrow? Well, he is smitten with her. And do you remember what her mom-in-law told her to do? She said, okay, Ruth, this is what you need to do. Take a bath, lots of perfume, wait till Boaz's heart is merry with wine, wait till he's in the middle of nowhere, go uncover his feet. Okay, that's a euphemism in the Hebrew Bible. He'll tell you what to do. Really, Naomi? That sounds a whole lot like the daughters thing. And aren't that where the Moabites come from? And isn't Ruth a Moabite? It's like totally bad thing. So here's this man smitten in love with this woman. He wakes up. He's drunk out of his mind, or his heart's merry with wine. She's uncovered his feet and says, cover your maidservant. And it's like, okay, so what's going to happen? You're watching that on HBO. What's going to happen? Okay, the camera's going to pan to the fireplace. There's going to be saxophone music. The deal's going to go down, right? Because that's what happens. And what is Boaz? What does Boaz say? He's half drunk in the middle of nowhere. He says, no. He says, there's a man who has a right to marry you. We'll present your case tomorrow to him. If he says no, I'll marry you in a heartbeat. But it would not be right for us to do this. And that's what they do, right? And the guy, next day, he says, okay, you have the right. And he says, oh, you get the field. And he says, great, I'll take the field. And he says, oh, by the way, you get Ruth. And he says, well, I don't want Ruth. And he says, so you don't want the field either? And he says, no, okay. So Boaz says, good, I want Ruth. And they get married. Finally, one guy in the story who can do what's right sexually, right? That's kind of a hero, right? I mean, nobody else. Do you know who Boaz's mother is in the story? Rahab. And remind me what Rahab's profession in life was. She was a prostitute. So did Boaz get his ability to resist sexual sin from his natural chromosomal inheritance from where he came from in life? Or did God raise up a man who had no... Do you know Boaz's name means here comes strength? Do you know he lives in Bethlehem? Do you know he's one of the pillars in the temples named after him, and he saves 2 scandalous women? That sounds like another story in the Bible. I'm trying to think who that is. Somebody from Bethlehem, sexually pure, saves, scandalous. Oh yeah, I know who that is. God wanted Boaz to mirror Jesus. And so in spite of the fact that his mom was a prostitute, God was able to save him. God was able to make him a sexually pure person. And God can save every one of us. It's not about where we come from. It's not about DNA. It's not about that. It's about God. It's about God saving the unworthy. Now, I love giving that testimony, but how does that testimony relate to Paul trying to fix a racist church with 2 people looking at each other and judging each other? How does that have anything to do with that truth? Well, it has this to do with it. If you can get your mind around the idea of sovereign, unmerited grace, of God saving us, God saving not good people, but God coming to people who have nothing inherently to commend them to God, and God showing grace, if you can embrace that truth, it's the first step down a path to not judging other people, because you realize if God saved me, God can save anybody. And yeah, I've been married 31 years. I've never had an affair. I have lived. I have a good family. But is any of that because of me? Or is it because God had mercy on me? God loving me out of my sin? It's about God. And if it is about God, then how in the world could I ever look down on anybody else? That's going to be Paul's argument here. Look, God saved us by grace. God isn't saving people who are inherently good. God's saving people and making them good. If you want to fix racism, if you want to fix judging other people, the doctrine that does that is unmerited grace. Let grace be grace. It's no harder for God to save anybody than it is for God to save us. And if we can begin to wrestle with that truth, I think we'll be well on our way to understanding Paul's teaching in Romans. Now, before we go on, anybody want to ask me about any of that? You're welcome. We'll interact. I'm happy to answer questions. If not, we can go on. Anybody want to ask anything or?
I guess in relation to your testimony, when you found out like the truth, did you almost feel like a bitterness towards either your biological parents, or even God for like, why am I the one that comes in this situation?
No, what it did pretty quickly was it explained lots of my life. Like, you've heard of people that have addictive personalities. Have you ever heard of that? So I have an addictive personality. And there are things that happen where I just can't say no to things. Like one that I struggle with even today is if I buy breath mints, I'll eat every one of them in like 30 minutes. I just can't say no. Right? Well, where did I get that from? Just, where did I get that lack of ability to say no? I got it from the natural offspring, and I laugh at myself, but I realize in that, wow, I really do have an addictive personality. I got saved when I was 18 years old, and I was a wicked, wicked, wicked person. I knew I was wicked, and I struggled with drugs. I struggled with I started taking drugs. I'd take tons of drugs. I'd take so many drugs, I should be dead. I mean, it's stupid. Where did I get it from? My mom. My mom couldn't say no. I couldn't say no. I have crazy thoughts sometimes. Can I get a witness? Anybody else have crazy thoughts? Like you stand on a train platform and you just have to step back because you're afraid you'll jump in front of the train. You ever have that? Like, I have those all the time. Have since I was a kid. Well, I don't know. You just take a stab in the dark. Where do you think that came from in life? I probably got it honest from my mom and dad. There are other issues, horrible issues. Where did I get it? I got it from them, but the truth is it was a relief because it was like, oh, that kind of makes sense now. And to be able to go to God and say, God, you made a deal. If I call in the name of the Lord, you would save me. And you knew where I came from, and you knew what you were obligating yourself. So it's actually become something that I've embraced and actually cherished. But I will say that I have given that testimony and people have used it against me. One time I told a man in the church my testimony, and I was visiting this older lady, and she started talking to me about something, and I thought, wow, this is a really weird situation. And she said, oh, I've heard where you come from. And I was kind of a little miffed at that. You know, it's like, one, you know, somebody shared something that I had shared to them. And then I thought, well, you know, I don't care. It's the truth. But then I kind of felt sad for the man and the lady because I thought, you know, they probably look down at me and feel like they're inherently more savable. And then I realized that's what we all do, isn't it? We believe ourselves inherently more savable, inherently better. Look, I make no claim to inherent goodness. I'm a wicked person. I'm a sinful person. I'm a challenged person. I got baggage. But the truth is that God is a great God. And God can break the power of canceled sin. God can set the prisoner free. I should be so addicted to everything that's wrong in life and I'm not? Why am I not? Is it because something inherent in me? No, it's because Jesus saved me. So when I walk into the 7-Eleven and I see the little baby, she's a single mom, she's got another, she's smoking a cigarette and she's buying vodka or something, you know what? I look at her and think, wow, she is so much better than my biological mom, because my biological mom would be buying heroin, not vodka, not cigarettes. And I don't know. I think if we can grapple with that truth, for me, it hasn't fixed me. I still can be an arrogant person, a pompous person. I still can think a lot about myself, but God's fixing me of that. God's helping me realize that none of that's true, and that what is true is His grace. So I have come to like the thing, but I am still intrigued. I have the woman's name. I have her address. I think I know who she is. I think I may have a sister in the mental institution, but I don't know. I've never met any of them. So.
Have you ever wanted to?
Oh, I've wanted to, like, all get out, just because I like puzzles, and but I haven't. So, Matt?
That's what I was going to ask. Like, do you ever see yourself like going to your mom?
I want to. I think she's dead, but if she is alive, I do want to, because I don't think. I mean, think of a woman who's a prostitute who's using heroin or whatever while she's pregnant. What's the likelihood that baby's going to grow up and be a Presbyterian minister and teach Greek at Bryan College? I mean, just take a stab in the dark. Probably not very likely. But God, you being dead in your trespasses, but God. And if I ever do have the opportunity, I will share with her. Yes.
I feel like you personally would have turned out differently had you known the truth your entire life. Not because like your adopted parents were putting more emphasis or less emphasis, but just like you personally, your thought life. Do you think things would have turned out differently?
I think my parents pushed me to succeed academically, and I think I worked much harder. And my sister, who's a lovely person, came from a very, I can't say very bad, but it seemed bad, and my parents, adopted parents, unknowingly would say things like, well, you're struggling in class and we know that you can't really do it. And I think my sister may have lived up to that. I mean, in terms of ethics, was that pious lie wrong that the lawyer told? Because evidently the judge was in on it, and he actually put pressure on my biological mother to give me up for adoption. Can I fault the lawyer and the judge for the pious lie and the pressure? I'm not justifying what they did, but having received that, I think it did help just in how people interacted with me. But I don't know. Corianne?
I was just going to ask if, you mentioned that your sister, because she didn't come from the background that your parents thought that you had come from. When you found out that you did come from a different background than what they thought, did it make you feel maybe pity for your sister and how she had come from a different background than what they thought, and because of how they had reacted, it may have
caused her to live differently than she could have, and that could have been you if they had known that?
I think that's exactly right. If her lawyers had told a pious lie about her, I mean, you do treat people differently, don't you? If you told someone, "Oh, this adopted baby is Warren Buffett's grandson," or granddaughter, he's like the richest man in the world or something. You would say, "Oh, wow, this baby's probably going to be great at business," and you would always, anytime you sell lemonade, "Oh, you're like the best," and that affirmation probably makes you want to do better. And so, would you? That's my gut reaction. I'm told by people who actually study that phenomenon that it may not be as true as it seems it would be true, but I have a hard time not believing that it does make a difference how people interact. And I know, growing up under that for 38 years, that it did affect how I thought of myself.
Did it maybe, once you found out, help you feel like you had a connection with your sister that maybe you hadn't had before?
It should. I've allowed my sister and myself to become estranged, and I don't know. I don't have the wisdom to fix that, but I'm praying that God will fix it, and praying that God will empower me to do whatever I need to do. I know that my sister did not go as far as in academia as I did, and that has created tension, and it's totally not her fault, but I don't know what to do about it. So, well, I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.